For centuries, crow calls were background noise, a harsh caw overhead, easy to tune out. But a wave of new research, using artificial intelligence to analyze corvid vocalizations, is forcing scientists to rethink what's actually happening in that noise. And along the way, it's raising uncomfortable questions about something much closer to home, how human language itself came to be. The most detailed of these projects is unfolding in the forests of northern Spain, where evolutionary biologists Dr. Daniela Canestrari and Dr. Vittorio Baglione of the University of Leon have spent years studying an unusual population of carrion crows. Most crows live alone or in pairs. This population doesn't. Offspring stay with their parents for up to 4 years, helping defend territory and raise new siblings, a level of extended family cooperation that's rare in the bird world. That cooperation raised an obvious question. Are these crows saying more to each other than crows elsewhere? And is their vocal repertoire part of what makes the cooperative lifestyle possible? To find out, the team fitted crows with tiny biologgers, miniature backpacks combining microphones and motion sensors, light enough not to interfere with flight. Over time, the devices captured roughly 150,000 vocalizations, alongside data on exactly what the bird was doing when it made each sound: flying, feeding, defending territory, interacting with a family member. That combination is what makes the dataset special. It isn't just audio. It's audio paired with behavioral context, at a scale no human research team could plausibly hand-label. That's where AI comes in. Crows don't only caw. Much of their vocal repertoire is quiet. Soft rattles, clicks, and murmurs pitched well below the volume of the calls most people associate with the species. Researchers using tools like vocalizations, an open-source AI system for detecting and segmenting bioacoustic recordings, have found that these subtle sounds make up a much larger share of crow communication than anyone appreciated. A human researcher combing through raw audio would likely have filtered out or simply missed most of it. AI models built for this kind of work don't try to translate the sounds into words. Instead, they convert each vocalization into a set of acoustic features: pitch, duration, rhythm, harmonic structure, and then look for patterns of similarity across thousands of recordings, sounds that share enough. Features get treated as belonging to the same cluster. The output isn't a dictionary, it's closer to a map, with regions instead of hard borders, where similar-sounding calls sit near each other and gradually shade into different clusters, rather than snapping into fixed, separate categories. This turns out to matter enormously for how scientists now think about animal and human communication. It helps to understand, at least roughly, what's happening inside a tool like vocalizations when it processes a day's worth of crow audio, because the mechanics explain why this generation of research looks so different from everything that came before it. The first job is simply detection, finding the boundaries of a vocalization inside a long, continuous, noisy recording. Field audio is full of wind, rustling leaves, distant traffic, other bird species, and overlapping crow calls happening at the same time. Older approaches to this problem relied on researchers manually scanning spectrograms, visual representations of sound frequency over time, and drawing boxes around anything that looked like a call. That process is slow, inconsistent between different human labelers, and simply doesn't scale to hundreds of thousands of recordings. Vocalizations and tools like it automate that boundary-finding step using neural networks trained to recognize the acoustic signature of a vocalization against background noise, even when calls overlap or are very quiet. Once a call is isolated, the system doesn't try to match it against a pre-existing dictionary of known crow sounds. Instead, it runs the isolated clip through a model that converts it into an embedding, a long list of numbers that captures the acoustic shape of the sound in a way that's mathematically comparable to every other clip's embedding. Two calls that sound similar end up with embeddings that sit close together in that numerical space. Two calls that sound very different end up far apart. From there, standard clustering techniques, and borrowed from the same toolbox used in fields like genomics and image recognition, get applied to the whole collection of embeddings at once. The clustering doesn't know or care what a crow call is supposed to sound like. It just finds the natural groupings that fall out of the data itself. That's the crucial difference from the older label-first approach. Nobody tells the model in advance that crows have, say, a rally call and an alarm call. The model finds whatever structure is actually there, and researchers apply behavioral labels afterward, once they see what the clusters correspond to in the field. This is also why the resulting picture looks like a map rather than a list. Embeddings don't produce hard categories by default. They produce a continuous space, and clusters within that space can be tight and well separated or loose and overlapping, depending on how the underlying sounds actually behave. That's not a limitation of the method. It's the method accurately reflecting something true about the vocalizations themselves. Some of a crow's repertoire really is discrete and categorical, and some of it really is graded and continuous. and the old label-first approach to bioacoustics was simply not built to notice the difference. For most of the 20th century, researchers cataloging animal vocalizations worked the way an early naturalist would. Listen to a sound, decide it's a distinct type, give it a label, and count how often it occurs. It's an approach built on the assumption that a species' calls come as a fixed set of discrete units, like a small alphabet. The AI-driven approach flips that assumption. Rather than predefining categories and sorting calls into them, researchers let the model discover structure organically in the acoustic data first, then examine what it found. Recent work on crow vocalizations has found something researchers describe as graded and continuous, more geometry than glossary. Some clusters are tight and well separated, functioning much like traditional call types. Others blend smoothly into one another with individual birds, or a bird's emotional or situational state, nudging a call gradually across the acoustic space rather than jumping between fixed slots. That distinction, discrete units versus graded, continuous variation, is exactly the kind of distinction linguists care about when they talk about what makes human language special. And it's why crow research keeps circling back to questions about us. Human language is often described as fundamentally different from animal communication because it's compositional. We combine a limited set of discrete sounds, phonemes, into words, and a limited set of words into an effectively infinite number of sentences. The compositional, rule-based combination is frequently cited as the sharpest dividing line between human language and everything else in the animal kingdom. What the AI mapping of crow calls is complicating is the everything else side of that line. If some portion of a crow's vocal repertoire behaves like a set of discrete combinable units, and another portion behaves like continuous graded signaling that blends meaning the way a facial expression or a tone of voice does, then crows may not sit cleanly on one side of the discrete parse graded divide at all. They may sit on both sides simultaneously, deploying different strategies for different communicative needs. That's not the same as saying crows have a language in the human sense. Researchers are careful, almost insistent, about not overclaiming here. But it does chip away at the idea that discreteness itself is a uniquely human trick. If a wild corvid can build small, structured combinable units within an otherwise graded system, then the raw ingredient that made human language possible, the capacity to treat some sounds as switchable, recombinable parts, isn't something evolution invented from scratch for us. The Spanish Crow Project isn't operating in isolation. It sits inside a broader scientific movement, led in part by organizations like the Earth Species Project, that is trying to build foundation models, the same category of AI architecture behind large language models, trained not just on animal sounds, but on a mixture of animal vocalizations, human speech, and music simultaneously. The logic behind mixing these data types together is worth sitting with. If you train a model exclusively on crow sounds, it can only ever tell you about crow sounds. But if you train a model on human speech, music, and animal calls together and ask it to find shared structure, you're testing something bigger. Whether there are universal acoustic or organizational principles that show up across every communication system built by an evolved brain, biological hardware constraints included. Early findings from this line of work suggest that some patterns, the way information gets front-loaded or compressed, the way rhythm gets used to mark boundaries between meaningful chunks, the way certain sound transitions are favored over others, recur across species in a way that looks less like coincidence and more like a shared solution to a shared engineering problem. How do you pack the most meaning into the least amount of signal, transmitted as fast as possible, without your listener losing the thread? If that holds up under further scrutiny, it reframes human language less as a bolt of evolutionary lightning that struck only our species, and more as one particularly elaborate expression of communicative principles that nature reaches for repeatedly in whatever species faces enough social complexity to need them. The crow research doesn't exist in a vacuum. And understanding where it sits relative to other AI-driven animal communication projects helps explain why scientists are taking the graded plus discrete finding seriously rather than dismissing it as a quirk of one dataset. Project CETI, the Cetacean Translation Initiative, has spent several years applying similar AI techniques to sperm whale communication. Sperm whales produce patterned sequences of clicks called codas, and CETI's models have found that these codas combine a small set of acoustics features, rhythm, tempo, and a subtle vibrato-like modulation, into combinations that behave, structurally, a little like a phonetic alphabet, a limited inventory of building blocks that get recombined into a much larger number of distinct sequences. Elephant researchers have made comparable progress with rumbles, low-frequency vocalizations that carry for miles, and that elephants appear to use as individualized names for specific other elephants, a discovery that itself relied on machine learning to detect patterns invisible to the human ear. Primate researchers working with species like Campbell's monkeys and chimpanzees have used similar AI clustering approaches to revisit long-standing debates about whether primate alarm calls can be combined the way words are. For example, whether adding a particular suffix-like sound to an alarm call changes its meaning in a rule-governed way, similar to how adding "its om s" to an English noun signals plurality. None of these projects, including the crow research, has produced anything resembling a full translation of another species' communication system. But taken together, they represent a genuine shift in method across an entire field. Instead of researchers imposing human linguistic categories onto animal sounds from the outside and testing whether the animals seem to fit, AI is being used to let the structure of each species' own communication system emerge from the data first, and only afterward, asking how that structure compares to what humans do. It's worth being precise here, because the temptation with this kind of research is to leap straight to scientist-decoded crow language, and that's not what's happened. The scientists closest to the work are explicit that current AI models can map, cluster, and characterize vocalizations, but they cannot translate them. There is no crow to English dictionary at the end of this pipeline, and researchers are wary of anyone claiming otherwise. What the mapping approach can do is generate testable hypotheses. If a particular cluster of sounds shows up overwhelmingly when a biologger's motion sensor also shows a parent feeding a juvenile, that's a strong hint the cluster relates to parent offspring. Interaction, even without knowing what, specifically, is being communicated within it. If another cluster spikes only during territorial disputes with neighboring families, researchers can start testing whether it functions as a warning, a threat display, or a rallying call to other family members. That distinction matters, because it's also the honest answer to why this is shocking in the way it actually is. Not because crows turn out to be reciting poetry, but because the tools finally exist to ask precise questions about animal communication that used to be unanswerable in principle, not just in practice. To appreciate why the AI moment feels different, it's worth remembering how many times science has tried this before and hit a wall. The most famous attempts happened in the 20th century with primates. Researchers raised chimpanzees and gorillas alongside human families, or taught them sign language and symbol boards, hoping direct exposure to a human-like linguistic environment would unlock something latent in the animal's own capacities. Projects like these, involving apes such as Washoe, Koko, and Nim Chimpsky, produced animals capable of learning hundreds of signs and using some of them in flexible, sometimes surprising ways. Bioacoustics researchers studying wild animals in the decades since have carried that lesson as a permanent caution. It's part of why the current crop of scientists working with crows, whales, and elephants are so insistent about the limits of what their models can claim, and why terms like decode get used carefully, if at all, in the actual scientific papers, even when press coverage reaches for it in headlines. What's different this time isn't that researchers have become less ambitious. If anything, the ambition, build genuinely cross-species communication tools, is larger than ever. What's different is the method. Instead of a small number of researchers spending years in close daily contact with a handful of captive animals, interpreting behavior through inevitably human eyes, AI models process vocalizations from hundreds of individuals in the wild, blind to any human hope about what the animal should be saying, and flag only the patterns that hold up statistically across the entire dataset. It's a way of building a firewall between what researchers want to find and what the data actually shows, the exact failure mode that undid so much of the earlier ape language research. Corvids, the family that includes crows, ravens, magpies, and jays, have been a magnet for cognition research for decades, independent of this AI work. They recognize individual human faces and hold grudges against people who've wronged them. They use, and even manufacture tools, something long assumed to require a primate-level brain. They cache food with an awareness that other crows might be watching and steal from the horde, and will deceptively rehide food if they sense they've been observed. A behavior that implies some model of what another mind might be thinking, sometimes called theory of mind. None of that guarantees sophisticated vocal communication. Cognition and communication are related but distinct capacities, but it makes crows a reasonable place to look. A brain capable of tracking social relationships, anticipating deception, and solving multi-step physical problems is a brain that plausibly has something worth saying and evolutionary pressure to say it efficiently. The cooperative breeding crows of Spain sharpen that logic further. In a family unit where several individuals coordinate territory defense and cooperative parenting over multiple years, the payoff for precise, information-rich signaling is high, and the cost of ambiguous signaling is real. A botched warning call could mean a lost sibling or a lost territory. Evolutionary biologists have long predicted that social complexity should track with communicative complexity. The AI mapping work is, for the first time, giving that prediction something concrete to test itself against. It would be irresponsible to write about this research without laying out where it's genuinely shaky, because there is real reason for caution. First, clustering is not meaning. An AI model finding that crow calls fall into 9 statistically distinguishable groups tells you those calls are acoustically different from one another. It does not, by itself, tell you those differences are meaningful to the crows, let alone what the meaning is. Humans are extremely good at finding patterns, and easily good enough at anthropomorphizing that the AI-found structure can quietly slide into the AI-found language in the retelling, even when the underlying scientists are being careful. Second, correlation with behavior is suggestive, not conclusive. A call cluster that shows up during feeding could relate to hunger, to the presence of a parent, to the specific location, or to something else entirely. That happens to co-occur with feeding in this data set. Untangling those alternatives takes years of further deliberately designed experiments, playback studies, controlled contexts, cross-population comparisons, not a single clustering pass over existing recordings. Third, the human language comparison is easy to oversell. Linguists have spent a century plus arguing about exactly what makes human language distinct: recursion, displacement, the ability to talk about things not present, arbitrary symbol meaning pairing, cultural transmission across generations, and more. Finding graded and discrete structure coexisting in crow calls touches on only one thread of that much larger rope. It's a genuinely interesting data point. It is not, on its own, evidence that crows have anything resembling grammar, syntax, or the referential precision of human words. The researchers behind the most credible versions of this work tend to say some version of the same thing. This changes how we study the question, not the answer to the question, at least not yet. The near-term trajectory of this research runs in a few directions at once. Playback experiments are the most direct next step. If you can isolate a call cluster you suspect means something specific, you play recordings of it back to crows in a controlled setting and see how they respond. If crows in a threatened territory context respond differently to a territorial cluster playback than to a feeding cluster playback, that's real evidence the acoustic clustering tracks functional meaning, not just superficial acoustic resemblance. Cross-population comparison is another. If the cooperative breeding crows of northern Spain have a vocal repertoire that differs measurably in size, structure, or the balance of discrete versus graded signaling from crow populations that don't live in extended family groups, that would be strong support for the idea that social complexity really is driving communicative complexity, rather than the correlation being incidental. And the broader foundation model effort, training AI jointly across species and against human speech, will keep testing whether the patterns found in crows generalize. If similar graded plus discrete structures or similar efficiency-driven organizational patterns keep turning up in whale clicks, elephant rumbles, and primate calls, that starts to look less like a crow-specific quirk and more like something close to a general acoustic communication principle, one that human language, for all its singular richness, would turn out to be an elaborate instance of rather than an exception to. The headline promise here isn't that scientists cracked a secret crow language and found it's basically English with more caws in it. Nothing in the credible research supports that. And any claim that goes further than AI helped us map and categorize crow vocalizations with unprecedented precision is running well ahead of the evidence. The actual shock, such as it is, sits one level down. It's the possibility that the line separating real language from animal noise, the line humans have drawn and redrawn for as long as there's been a science of language, may be far blurrier than the confident textbook version suggests. Discreteness, compositionality, and the efficient packing of meaning into sound may not be things evolution reserved for us. They may be tools evolution reaches for, in partial and unrefined form, whenever a species needs to coordinate closely enough and long enough with individuals it can't afford to misunderstand. Crows, it turns out, needed exactly that. And thanks to AI finally capable of listening at the scale and resolution the question demands, we're only now starting to notice what's been overhead, cawing away the entire time.